The night air over the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had disappeared beyond the western desert. Far across the dark water, small lamps flickered inside mud brick homes where tired families slowly settled into sleep. The smell of baked bread still lingered in narrow streets. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey shifted softly in its pen. Reeds near the riverbank moved gently beneath the slow desert wind. Ancient Egypt rested beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Along the edges of temple walls, oil lamps burned with soft yellow light. Their flames trembled gently against carved stone columns covered in faded colors and long rows of sacred symbols. Inside these silent temple courts, the priests of Egypt continued their slow nightly rituals while much of the world around them slept. Their footsteps echoed softly over cool stone floors. The priests moved carefully through shadowed hallways that smelled faintly of incense, smoke, and old linen cloth. Their white garments brushed against their ankles as they walked. Some carried bowls of water from the Nile. Others carried small baskets filled with bread, onions, dried figs, or flowers gathered earlier in the day before the heavy heat had settled across the land. The temple itself felt almost like another world. Outside the walls, fishermen slept beside their boats. Farmers rested their aching backs after long days in the fields. Bakers prepared dough before dawn. Stone workers rubbed tired hands beside dim cooking fires. But inside the temple, time moved differently. The priests followed ancient routines that rarely changed. Day after day. Season after season. Generation after generation. Their lives belonged to ritual. Long before sunrise, while most homes remained dark and silent, the priests would wake from sleep upon simple woven mats laid across cool floors inside temple quarters. The air before dawn was often the most comfortable part of the day. The heavy desert heat had not yet returned. Small breezes drifted through narrow openings in the walls. For a few moments, the world felt calm and quiet. A priest would rise slowly in darkness, careful not to wake others sleeping nearby. He would wash himself with cool water poured from clay jars. The sound of water trickling into shallow stone basins echoed softly in the still room. Purity mattered deeply in temple life. Cleanliness was not simply comfort. It was part of sacred duty. Many priests shaved their entire bodies regularly. Even their eyebrows were sometimes removed. Loose hair was seen as unclean inside sacred spaces. The process took time and patience. Bronze razors glided carefully across skin in dim morning light while nearby lamps flickered gently against pale walls. The air often smelled faintly of oils and natron salt. Outside, the first birds slowly began to wake near the Nile reeds. The eastern horizon softened from black into dark blue. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, early workers were already beginning their day. Potters prepared wet clay. Bakers opened ovens. Farmers gathered simple tools before walking toward the riverbanks. Egypt slowly stirred awake. But the priests remained focused upon their careful routines. One by one, they entered sacred chambers in silence. Sandals whispered against smooth stone floors polished by countless generations of footsteps. Tall columns rose overhead like quiet forests carved from stone. Painted ceilings showed stars, birds, and heavenly boats drifting across deep blue colors now faded with age. The temple air remained cool before sunrise. In hidden inner rooms stood statues of the gods, resting quietly behind heavy wooden doors. Ordinary people rarely entered these sacred places. Even many workers inside the temple complex never saw the inner chambers. Only certain priests were allowed close to the sacred figures hidden deep within the dark sanctuary. At dawn, the ritual of waking the god would begin. The doors opened slowly. Oil lamps cast soft golden light across statues covered in shadow. Incense smoke curled upward in thin pale streams. The priests bowed their heads. Their voices remained low and steady as they spoke ancient prayers memorized through years of careful study. The statues themselves were often small compared to the great temples surrounding them. Some were made of wood covered in gold. Others were carved from stone darkened by centuries of smoke and oil. Yet to the priests, these figures were not simple objects. They were sacred homes for divine presence. Every movement around them had meaning. Fresh linen cloth was unfolded carefully. Bowls of scented oil were opened. Cool water was poured gently over stone basins. One priest cleaned the statue slowly while another prepared offerings of bread, beer, fruit, and flowers gathered from temple gardens near the Nile. The rituals moved slowly. Nothing was rushed. Outside the sanctuary, servants swept temple courtyards with reed brushes. Dust gathered endlessly in Egypt. Wind carried fine sand through streets, homes, workshops, and temples alike. Cleaning never truly ended. Even the grandest temples required constant care. Young boys carried water jars balanced carefully against their shoulders. Their feet slapped softly against stone paths warmed by the first light of morning. Some of these boys were temple servants learning sacred duties little by little. Others simply belonged to working families employed by the temple kitchens or storage houses. The temple was not only a place of worship. It was also a center of labor. Large temple complexes employed hundreds of ordinary people. Bakers worked near great clay ovens where heat filled the air long before sunrise. Brewers prepared thick beer stored inside heavy jars. Scribes bent over wooden tables copying records onto sheets of papyrus. Garden workers watered herbs and flowers beneath the growing sunlight. Every task followed routine. Every routine followed time. And time itself followed the Nile. The river shaped nearly every part of Egyptian life. Its waters brought food, trade, mud for bricks, fish for cooking, and fertile soil for farming. Without the Nile, the land beyond its banks became endless desert beneath the burning sun. Even the priests depended completely upon the river. At certain times of year, the Nile flooded slowly across wide fields, leaving behind rich black soil when the waters retreated. Farmers watched the river carefully because their survival depended upon its rhythms. During flood season, many farming tasks paused. Workers repaired tools, carried stones, cleaned canals, or labored on building projects sponsored by temples and rulers. The priests watched the river closely as well. The flooding was sacred to them. Everything connected together. The rising water. The growing crops. The movement of stars overhead. The ceremonies inside temple walls. The health of workers in the fields. The journeys of fishermen drifting quietly through morning mist. Egyptian life moved like the river itself. Slow. Steady. Ancient. As daylight spread across the temple courtyards, the sounds of the waking city slowly grew louder beyond the walls. Merchants called softly to one another while preparing goods for market. Goats wandered narrow streets. Clay pots clinked gently together as women carried water home from public wells. The smell of baking bread drifted through the morning air. Inside the temple kitchens, workers mixed grain into thick dough using tired arms already damp with sweat. Egypt was beautiful in the quiet hours of dawn, but labor began early because the heat would soon become difficult beneath the rising sun. A young kitchen worker wiped sweat from his forehead while feeding wood into a clay oven. Another carried baskets of onions and lentils across the courtyard. Their simple linen clothing already clung slightly to their skin. The priests passed among them quietly. Some priests came from wealthy families. Others had more ordinary beginnings. But inside the temple, daily ritual often erased many outside differences. Duties remained demanding regardless of status. Long hours of memorization, purification, and ceremony shaped their lives from youth into old age. Many priests also worked as scribes. Writing was sacred in Egypt. The ability to read and record symbols upon papyrus brought respect and responsibility. Scribes spent long hours seated cross-legged with palettes balanced upon their knees. Reed brushes dipped carefully into black and red ink while records filled endless rolls of papyrus stored inside temple archives. They recorded grain deliveries, animal counts, offerings, land agreements, festivals, funeral preparations, medical remedies, tax collections. Temple life depended upon records as much as prayers. The scribes often worked in rooms open to small courtyards where air could move more freely. Even so, the heat became difficult by midday. Sweat dampened their hands. Flies buzzed lazily through still air. Sometimes a scribe paused simply to stretch aching fingers while distant temple chants echoed faintly through stone halls. Beyond the writing rooms, incense drifted steadily from sacred chambers. The smell settled into everything. Linen cloth, wooden doors, stone walls. Even the hair and skin of temple workers carried traces of smoke and scented oil. Hours passed slowly beneath the growing sun. Outside the city, farmers bent over fields of barley and emmer wheat. Their feet sank into damp soil near irrigation canals. Water lifted from the Nile using simple tools splashed softly into narrow channels cut through the earth. The work was endless and exhausting. Many farmers worked while half asleep during the hottest months. The heat pressed heavily against their shoulders and backs. Insects gathered near standing water. Mud clung between tired toes. Yet the work continued because the river gave life only to those who labored beside it. The priests prayed for balance in all things. Too little flooding could bring hunger. Too much flooding could destroy homes and grain stores. Everything depended upon delicate rhythms. Evening prayers inside the temples often included requests for harmony across the land. The priests asked for healthy crops, calm waters, fertile animals, and protection from sickness. Disease moved easily through crowded ancient cities where heat, insects, and poor sanitation surrounded daily life. Workers often suffered quietly through pain and exhaustion. A stone carrier with damaged knees. A fisherman weakened by fever. An elderly baker coughing beside hot ovens. A servant with aching hands cracked from endless washing. Life in ancient Egypt could be peaceful, but it was never easy. The priests saw much of this suffering. Temple complexes sometimes distributed food during difficult seasons. Physicians connected to temple life prepared remedies from herbs, honey, oils, and minerals. Some treatments helped. Others simply offered comfort. Medical knowledge mixed together with ritual and prayer in ways difficult to separate. As midday approached, the temple stones themselves began storing heat from the powerful sun overhead. Shadows shortened. The bright sky became almost white. Workers moved more slowly. Even animals searched for shade. Inside shaded temple corridors, priests continued their duties with calm patience. One group prepared offerings for an afternoon ceremony. Another cleaned sacred vessels using water carried carefully from the Nile. In distant chambers, older priests instructed younger students in memorized prayers repeated countless times across generations. The learning process could take years. Young trainees listened carefully while seated upon reed mats inside cool rooms dimly lit against the afternoon glare. Their teachers spoke slowly, correcting small mistakes in pronunciation or movement. Ritual demanded precision. Even simple gestures carried symbolic meaning. The students learned discipline above all else. Patience. Silence. Routine. The temple shaped every hour of their lives. Outside, ordinary families endured the difficult afternoon heat as best they could. Many people rested briefly when possible. Workshops became quieter during the hottest hours. Dogs slept beneath carts. Donkeys stood motionless in narrow shadows cast by mud brick walls. The entire land seemed to breathe more slowly beneath the burning sun. Then gradually, as afternoon softened toward evening, movement returned. Children carried baskets through crowded streets. Fishermen prepared nets along riverbanks. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Women ground grain between heavy stones while speaking softly together outside small homes. The smell of lentil stew drifted through warm evening air. Temple musicians prepared instruments for ceremonies held after sunset. Soft drums, rattles, and long wooden flutes created slow echoing sounds beneath painted ceilings while lamps flickered against gold and blue temple walls. The rituals at night felt different from those held during daylight. More mysterious. More silent. Darkness transformed the temples. Massive columns disappeared into shadow overhead. Torchlight danced across carved images of gods, birds, rivers, stars, and sacred boats. Priests moved through the darkness carrying incense burners that released sweet smoke into the still air. The world outside quieted gradually. Families gathered for simple evening meals. Bread was torn by hand. Beer poured slowly into clay cups. Tired workers rubbed sore feet before sleep. Some people sat upon rooftops hoping for cooler air beneath the stars. The Nile reflected moonlight in long silver lines. Frogs called softly from the reeds. Somewhere distant, oars dipped gently into dark water as late fishermen crossed the river in silence. Inside temple walls, the priests completed the final rituals of the day. Offerings left earlier before sacred statues were removed carefully. Lamps were trimmed. Linen coverings adjusted. Sanctuary doors closed slowly once more. Sacred words echoed softly through hidden chambers before fading into stillness. Then came silence. Deep temple silence. Only footsteps remained. A priest carrying a small lamp walked through empty halls checking doors and storage rooms before sleep. The light trembled softly against ancient stone. Dust drifted slowly through the warm air. Outside, wind moved lightly across the desert beyond the fertile river valley. Egypt rested again beneath the stars. The priests returned quietly to their sleeping quarters. Some spoke softly together before lying down upon woven mats. Others preferred silence after long hours of ritual. Their bodies ached much like the workers outside temple walls. Standing, walking, washing, lifting offerings, memorizing prayers, maintaining ceremonies day after day demanded patience and endurance. Even sacred life brought exhaustion. One older priest lowered himself carefully onto his sleeping mat while rubbing stiffness from his knees. Another drank cool water slowly from a clay cup before extinguishing a nearby lamp. Darkness settled gently through the room. Soon only distant night sounds remained. The Nile moving quietly. Wind touching reeds. An animal shifting somewhere beyond the walls. And overhead, the same stars that had watched Egypt for thousands of years continued their slow silent journey across the night sky. Before the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, the temple was already awake again. The night had passed quietly over the Nile Valley. Darkness still rested across the fields, though the stars had begun to fade little by little above the desert hills. The air carried a coolness that would vanish after sunrise. For a short while, Egypt belonged to silence. Inside the sleeping quarters of the priests, soft movement began in the darkness. A man sat upright slowly upon his woven mat. His joints felt stiff from years of standing through ceremonies and long processions beneath heavy heat. He rubbed his eyes gently and listened for a moment to the faint sounds outside the chamber walls. Somewhere nearby, sandals scraped lightly across stone. Another priest poured water from a clay jar into a shallow basin. The sound echoed softly through the dim room. A small oil lamp flickered weakly near the doorway, casting unsteady shadows against mud plaster walls. No one hurried. The morning rituals always began slowly. The priests washed carefully in silence. Cool water moved across tired skin. Some whispered quiet prayers beneath their breath while cleansing their hands, faces, and shaved heads. Purification before entering sacred spaces remained deeply important. Cleanliness was connected to order, and order was connected to the gods themselves. The temple depended upon these routines. Without them, the world would feel unbalanced. Outside, the city still slept beneath darkness. Only a few early workers had begun to stir. Far down near the riverbank, fishermen prepared small boats beside clusters of reeds wet with dew. Their movements were slow and practiced. Nets were untangled quietly beneath fading stars while the Nile drifted beside them like dark glass. The river smelled of wet earth and cool mud before dawn. A faint breeze carried that smell toward the temple walls. Soon the priests stepped into long corridors lined with painted columns. The stone beneath their sandals felt cool in the early hour. Oil lamps rested inside wall niches, their flames trembling softly as men passed through the shadows carrying bowls, linens, and baskets of offerings. The deeper parts of the temple remained silent. Massive doors protected sacred inner chambers where statues rested unseen in darkness. The priests approached carefully, speaking little. Even after years inside these halls, many still felt a quiet heaviness near the sanctuary rooms. The air there seemed older somehow. Still. Untouched by ordinary life. The first ritual of the morning began with light. A lamp was lifted slowly toward the face of the god. Warm gold flickered across polished stone and painted surfaces. Incense smoke rose upward in thin twisting lines. One priest bowed low while another unfolded fresh linen cloth carefully prepared the night before. The statue was cleaned gently. Oil was rubbed across sacred surfaces. Perfumed ointments filled the chamber with the smell of cedar, myrrh, and flowers gathered from temple gardens beside the Nile. The scents mixed with smoke and old stone until the room itself seemed wrapped in a warm haze. Outside the sanctuary, young temple servants waited quietly with baskets of bread. Most of them were boys from ordinary families. Some hoped for better lives through temple service. Others had been sent there simply because their parents needed work or protection during difficult seasons. They carried water jars, swept floors, polished vessels, and learned discipline through repetition. Temple life shaped children early. A boy no older than 12 balanced a heavy jar against his shoulder while following an older servant through the courtyard. His bare feet were dusty from the packed earth paths between storage buildings. He yawned quietly as the eastern sky slowly brightened above the walls. The day ahead would be long. Already the kitchen workers were awake. The smell of grain and smoke drifted outward from large clay ovens where bakers shaped rough loaves beneath dim torchlight. Sweat formed quickly on their skin from the growing heat of the fires. One woman kneaded dough steadily while another crushed dried herbs nearby using a stone mortar worn smooth by years of labor. Temple kitchens never truly rested. Food was needed constantly. For priests. 4 servants, 4 guards, 4 laborers attached to temple lands, 4 travelers seeking shelter, 4 sacred offerings placed before the gods each day. Storage rooms filled with grain sacks lined entire sections of the complex. Scribes carefully recorded every delivery. Egypt depended upon counting and measuring nearly everything. Grain meant survival. Bread meant life itself. The scribes began work early. Inside shaded writing rooms, men sat cross-legged before wooden boards covered with papyrus sheets. Their reed brushes moved slowly in the growing morning light. Some copied religious texts from older scrolls already fading with age. Others tracked temple property, livestock, or taxes gathered from nearby villages. The scratch of brush against papyrus became part of the morning rhythm. Outside, dawn finally spread across the Nile Valley. Golden light touched the tops of palm trees first. Then came the mud brick rooftops. Then the distant fields. Thin morning mist drifted above irrigation canals while birds circled low over the water searching for fish. Egypt awakened gradually. Farmers stepped onto narrow paths carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. Women swept dust from house entrances using reed brooms. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes beside cooking fires where simple breakfast simmered slowly in clay pots. The smell of warm bread spread through the streets. Near the riverbank, merchants prepared boats loaded with onions, jars of beer, woven baskets, fish packed in salt, and bundles of flax ready for trade farther north or south along the Nile. Life flowed outward from the river every morning. And the priests watched over this flow through ritual. One older priest climbed slowly toward the roof of a temple building where the morning air remained cooler. From there he could see the city beginning its day. Smoke curled upward from hundreds of homes. Dogs wandered narrow alleys searching for scraps. Workers moved like small figures through dusty streets already warming beneath the rising sun. The priest stood quietly for a long moment. He had served the temple for more than 30 years. His hands showed signs of age now. The skin had grown rough from endless washing and labor. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes from years spent beneath bright sunlight reflected off pale stone walls. Yet his routines remained unchanged. Every day followed the same careful order. In many ways, the sameness itself brought comfort. The predictability of ritual helped hold the world together. At least that was what many priests believed. The sun rose because sacred duties continued properly. The Nile flooded because balance remained protected. Crops grew because harmony existed between heaven, earth, river, and people. Everything was connected. Below the temple roof, the city grew louder. Hammering echoed from workshops where carpenters shaped wood for boats, furniture, and doors. Potters spun wet clay beneath skilled hands. Metal workers sweated beside hot furnaces shaping bronze tools used by farmers across the valley. Ancient Egypt was filled with labor. Even beautiful things required exhaustion. Large statues standing silently before temples had once been rough stone dragged across desert ground by teams of workers straining beneath ropes. Painted walls inside sacred chambers had been created by artists crouched for endless hours in dusty heat. Nothing appeared easily. And still the work continued. At the edge of the city, laborers repaired irrigation canals damaged during the last flood season. Mud clung thickly to their legs as they dug beneath the growing heat. Supervisors shouted instructions while scribes kept records nearby beneath simple shade coverings made from linen stretched between wooden poles. The priests sometimes visited these workers to perform blessings connected to the land and water. Ceremony reached into ordinary life constantly. A healthy harvest. A safe childbirth. Protection from illness. Safe travel along the river. good flooding, clean water, strong animals. Everything invited ritual. Inside the temple schoolrooms, young trainees practiced reciting prayers aloud together in calm, steady voices. Their teachers corrected posture and pronunciation carefully. The boys repeated lines over and over until the words became almost musical through repetition. Outside their windows, pigeons fluttered along stone ledges warmed by sunlight. The heat strengthened steadily toward midday. Workers across the city slowed their movements. The bright white glare above the streets became difficult to escape. Sandals scraped through dusty roads while sweat soaked simple linen clothing. Water carriers became more important with each passing hour. Near the temple gates, a man sold cool jars of watered beer to laborers resting briefly in narrow strips of shade. The beer was thick and cloudy. Not strong. More nourishing than intoxicating. Bread and beer formed the center of ordinary Egyptian meals. Wealthier families might enjoy fish, dates, figs, honey, duck, or roasted meat during festivals, but common workers often survived on much simpler food. A tired stone worker sat beneath a wall chewing bread slowly while rubbing his sore shoulder. Nearby, another man cleaned mud from his feet using water from a small clay bowl. Their conversation remained quiet beneath the heavy afternoon heat. The city itself seemed sleepy. Even animals moved carefully. Cats stretched lazily across shaded courtyards. Oxen flicked their tails slowly beside carts loaded with reeds and grain sacks. Donkeys stood nearly motionless while flies circled around their ears. Farther inside the temple complex, priests prepared for afternoon rituals. Fresh flowers were arranged carefully in shallow bowls. Lotus blossoms floated upon water collected from sacred pools. Incense was crushed into fine mixtures using stone tools darkened by years of use. One chamber smelled strongly of cedar oil. Another smelled of smoke and old papyrus. The deeper sanctuary rooms remained cool despite the heat outside. Their thick stone walls protected them from the harshest sunlight. Priests sometimes welcomed the silence there after hours spent moving through crowded courtyards filled with servants and workers. In the sanctuary darkness, time felt slower. One priest lit fresh lamps before a sacred statue while murmuring ancient words almost too softly to hear. The tiny flames reflected gently across gold surfaces. Shadows moved slowly along painted walls showing scenes of river life, offerings, birds, and stars. Outside, life remained difficult and physical. A woman carried heavy water jars across sunlit streets toward her family home. Her shoulders ached from years of similar labor. Nearby, children helped grind grain beneath the watchful eyes of older relatives. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Heat shimmered above rooftops. Ancient Egypt could feel peaceful from a distance. But daily life demanded endurance. At the riverbank, fishermen pulled nets from shallow waters glittering beneath afternoon light. Their hands smelled of fish and wet rope. Small boats rocked gently beside muddy reeds while insects buzzed across the surface of the Nile. One old fisherman paused to straighten his aching back. He stared quietly toward the distant temple rising above the city. Its tall columns glowed pale gold beneath the lowering sun. Smoke from incense drifted faintly into the bright sky. The temples watched over everything. Not only spiritually, economically as well. Many temples owned farmland, animals, workshops, fishing boats, and storage buildings. Entire communities depended upon them for work and food. Priests often managed large amounts of property through careful record-keeping performed by scribes working endlessly in shaded rooms. By late afternoon, long shadows finally began stretching across the streets. The worst heat slowly softened. Movement returned to the city again. Children laughed quietly while chasing one another near irrigation canals. Merchants reopened shaded stalls displaying onions, pottery, woven cloth, sandals, and dried fish. Workers returned home in small groups coated with dust and sweat after long hours of labor. The smell of evening meals filled the air. Lentils cooking slowly. Flatbread warming over small fires. Fish roasting beside river homes. The priests continued their duties through it all. Evening ceremonies often felt gentler than those held earlier in the day. The light changed everything. Golden sunlight entered temple courtyards at low angles, illuminating drifting incense smoke and worn stone carvings with soft warmth. Musicians arrived carrying instruments beneath their arms. The sound of drums echoed quietly through the halls. A flute began playing long slow notes that blended with evening wind moving through open courtyards. The music was calm and repetitive, designed less for performance and more for atmosphere. Priests carried offerings inward once more. Bread, fruit, beer, flowers, oil. The rituals repeated as they had for centuries. Outside the temple walls, families climbed onto rooftops after sunset seeking relief from the lingering heat trapped inside their homes. The night air moved more freely above the narrow streets. People sat quietly together beneath the stars while speaking softly about work, crops, sickness, river levels, marriages, or tomorrow's labor. The Nile reflected moonlight again. Its waters never truly rested. Boats drifted slowly through darkness carrying late travelers between villages. Oars dipped gently into black water. Frogs sang among reeds along the muddy banks. Back inside the temple, the final ceremonies of the night approached. Lamps glowed warmly inside shadowed corridors. The priests moved slowly now after many hours on their feet. Some looked exhausted beneath the flickering light. Yet the rituals remained careful. Even after long days, sacred routines could not become careless. The sanctuary doors closed once more. The god was left to rest in silence. One by one, the temple halls emptied. Servants finished sweeping dust from stone floors. Kitchen workers cleaned large bowls and storage jars. Scribes rolled completed papyrus sheets carefully before placing them into wooden chests. The city outside grew quieter. A baby cried briefly somewhere beyond the walls. A dog barked in the distance. Then stillness slowly returned to the Nile Valley. The priests lay down again upon simple sleeping mats while warm night air drifted through narrow windows high above them. Their bodies carried the weight of repetition. Endless days shaped by ceremony, heat, labor, and silence. Beyond the temple, the dark river continued moving north beneath the stars, carrying the slow-breathing world of ancient Egypt gently through another quiet night. The deepest hours of night passed softly over the Nile Valley. Most homes had gone quiet long ago. Cooking fires had faded into dim red embers. The narrow streets between mud brick houses rested beneath darkness and drifting dust. Somewhere in the distance, a baby stirred briefly before falling silent again. A dog barked once near the riverbank, then the sound disappeared into the warm night air. The temples remained awake longer than the city. Inside their great walls, a few lamps still flickered in distant corridors where late duties continued quietly. Some priests rested already upon woven reed mats, their breathing slow and steady after long hours of ritual. Others remained at work beside sacred rooms where silence felt heavy and ancient. One elderly priest sat alone beneath a painted column. Before him rested a small oil lamp and an unfinished scroll of papyrus. His tired eyes moved carefully across rows of symbols while his reed brush scratched softly against the page. The work demanded patience. Mistakes were difficult to correct. Ink dried quickly in the warm air. Beyond the open courtyard nearby, moonlight rested upon smooth stone floors. The old priest paused to flex his aching fingers. He had copied temple records for decades. Grain tallies, festival lists, land agreements, funeral texts, daily offerings. Endless records passed through his hands year after year until the symbols themselves seemed to live inside his mind even during sleep. Outside the temple walls, the Nile moved quietly through darkness. The river never stopped. Day or night, flood season or dry season, it continued its slow journey northward between the fertile banks that gave life to Egypt. Reeds bent gently beside the water while insects drifted over the surface beneath silver moonlight. Near the shoreline, several fishermen rested beside their tied boats. They would leave before dawn. For now they slept lightly beneath rough linen coverings spread across the ground. Their hands smelled of fish, river mud, and wet rope. One man shifted quietly in his sleep while nearby water lapped gently against wooden hulls. The night carried many small sounds. Soft wind touching reeds. Sand moving faintly across stone. Distant footsteps. Quiet breathing. A creaking wooden door somewhere inside the city. Ancient Egypt rarely became completely silent. Even so, the night hours felt peaceful compared to the noise and labor of daylight. Inside the temple, the old scribe finally rolled his papyrus closed and stood slowly from his low wooden seat. His knees protested with stiffness. Years spent sitting cross-legged and bending over scrolls had left their mark upon his body. He lifted the small oil lamp carefully. The flame danced gently as he walked through narrow halls lined with carved stone. Painted figures watched silently from the walls. Gods with animal heads. Sacred birds. River plants. Stars. Boats carrying souls through the afterlife. The carvings seemed almost alive in the flickering light. At the far end of the hallway, another priest swept fine dust from the floor using a reed brush. Dust entered everywhere in Egypt. Wind carried it through courtyards, sleeping chambers, kitchens, storage rooms, and sacred sanctuaries alike. Cleaning never truly ended. The younger priest worked slowly, half asleep with exhaustion. His shoulders ached beneath his linen robe. Earlier that day he had carried water jars from the river, assisted with purification rituals, and memorized long sacred passages under the guidance of an older teacher. Temple life required constant effort even from the youngest servants. The elderly scribe nodded quietly as he passed. Neither man spoke. Words felt unnecessary in the deep hours before dawn. Far across the city, ordinary families slept closely together inside small homes built from mud brick dried beneath the Egyptian sun. Some rested upon woven mats spread across packed earth floors. Others slept upon flat rooftops where the air moved more freely during hot seasons. Children curled beside parents. Clay jars stood near sleeping spaces filled with water drawn earlier from public wells or canals. Baskets of onions, grain, and dried fish hung from ceiling beams safe from insects and wandering animals. Life was simple for most people. But simple did not mean easy. Daily labor shaped every hour. A farmer's back remained sore even during sleep. A baker's arms carried the memory of kneading dough beside blazing ovens. A stone worker's hands stayed cracked and rough from carrying heavy loads beneath the burning sun. The priests knew these struggles well. Though separated by sacred duties, they still lived inside the same harsh climate. They walked the same dusty roads. They drank from the same river. They endured the same heat pressing heavily upon the valley each afternoon. Slowly, the stars began fading overhead. The eastern sky softened from black to deep blue. Another day approached. Near the temple kitchens, the first workers stirred awake once more. A woman wrapped linen cloth around her shoulders before stepping outside into the cool pre-dawn air. She moved quietly through the courtyard carrying kindling wood gathered the previous afternoon. Soon small fires crackled beneath clay ovens. The smell of smoke drifted upward into the fading darkness. Nearby, another worker ground grain between heavy stones with steady circular movements practiced since childhood. The rough sound echoed softly against the surrounding walls. The temple awakened gradually. Water carriers appeared first. Then bakers. Then sweepers. Then scribes. Then the priests themselves emerging silently from sleeping chambers after only a few hours of rest. The routines never paused. One young priest walked toward the river carrying 2 empty jars balanced carefully against a wooden pole across his shoulders. His sandals pressed softly into the dusty path leading downhill toward the Nile. Morning mist hovered low above the water. Birds called from the reeds. Several fishermen already pushed their narrow boats into the river while the sky remained dim and gray. Their movements were calm and familiar. Nets unfolded carefully. Oars dipped into dark water without splashing. The young priest knelt beside the riverbank. He filled the jars slowly. Cool water swirled around his fingers while mud shifted beneath his feet. The Nile smelled fresh before sunrise, carrying traces of wet earth, plants, and distant rain far to the south where the river began its long journey through unknown lands. For a moment the young priest simply listened. The soft movement of water. The creaking wood of fishing boats. The rustling reeds. This quiet hour before sunrise often felt sacred even without ceremony. Eventually he rose and began the slow walk back toward the temple as the first pale gold light touched the horizon. The city awakened fully soon after. Doors opened. Voices returned. Animals stirred in narrow streets. Merchants prepared their goods while children carried baskets and tools through crowded alleys already warming beneath the growing light. The smell of fresh bread spread quickly through the morning air. Inside the temple sanctuary, priests prepared the sacred awakening rituals once more. Fresh linen cloth rested folded neatly beside incense burners. Bowls of oil reflected the dim lamplight. Sacred words echoed softly through the chamber as doors to the inner sanctuary opened slowly. The god was awakened again. Every day followed this pattern. Not because priests lacked imagination, but because repetition itself created stability. The same prayers. The same gestures. The same offerings. The same careful washing and dressing of sacred statues. Order protected the world from chaos. At least that was what many believed deep within their hearts. Beyond the temple walls, ordinary labor expanded beneath the strengthening sun. Farmers entered fields carrying hoes and baskets. Irrigation canals glimmered between rows of crops stretching toward the riverbanks. Water lifted from the Nile splashed into narrow channels feeding thirsty soil. The work became harder as morning passed. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Mud coated ankles. Insects gathered near standing water. Still the workers continued because crops could not wait. A farmer paused briefly to straighten his back and wipe his forehead. Nearby, oxen moved slowly through damp earth pulling simple wooden plows. The smell of wet soil rose heavily beneath the warming sunlight. Farther away, stone workers hauled limestone blocks toward a building site connected to temple expansion. Thick ropes strained across their shoulders while supervisors shouted measured commands. Everything in Egypt demanded labor. Even sacred places. Inside one shaded temple courtyard, a group of scribes recorded incoming grain deliveries from nearby villages. Large sacks were weighed carefully before being carried toward storage rooms where guards monitored supplies. One scribe dipped his reed brush into ink while flies buzzed lazily around the table. His neck already ached from bending forward. The work required concentration despite heat and exhaustion. A small mistake in counting could create serious problems later. Temples fed large populations of workers and servants. Grain shortages brought fear quickly. The priests prayed constantly for balance. For healthy floods. For fertile land. For peace. For enough food to survive another season. As midday approached, the heat settled heavily across the valley again. Shadows shortened beneath the glaring white sky. The stone walls of the temple radiated warmth. Workers sought strips of shade wherever possible. Even the priests moved more slowly during the hottest hours. Inside dark sanctuary rooms, however, coolness remained. Thick walls protected the inner chambers from the full strength of the sun. Incense smoke drifted lazily through still air while oil lamps flickered before sacred statues. One older priest rested briefly against a column after completing a purification ceremony. His breathing felt heavy. Age made the heat harder to endure. Yet he would continue working until evening because ritual allowed little interruption. Younger assistants brought him water in small clay cups while nearby musicians practiced slow repeating melodies upon flutes and drums for upcoming ceremonies. The music echoed gently through the halls. Outside, life pressed onward beneath exhaustion. Women carried water jars balanced upon their heads. Children gathered reeds near canals. Boat builders hammered wooden planks together beside the river. Potters shaped clay vessels beneath shaded awnings while dust swirled through bright afternoon streets. Ancient Egypt was filled with movement. But it was rarely fast movement. The heat itself slowed the world. Everything happened with patience. Even arguments sounded softer beneath the heavy air. Toward late afternoon, the light slowly changed once again. The harsh brightness softened into warmer gold. Long shadows stretched across temple courtyards and city walls. People began breathing easier. Workers returned from the fields. Fishing boats drifted back toward shore carrying small catches packed inside woven baskets. The smell of evening cooking fires rose into the air. Inside homes, families prepared simple meals while speaking quietly about the day. Bread was shared. Beer poured slowly into cups. Tired children leaned against parents already half asleep from heat and labor. At the temple, evening rituals approached once more. Fresh incense burned. Lotus flowers floated in shallow bowls. Priests walked in slow processions through torchlit halls while musicians played calm repeating rhythms that echoed softly against ancient stone. The sanctuary glowed warmly beneath flickering light. Outside the walls, the Nile reflected the first stars appearing overhead. The river carried cool air across the valley now. Reeds whispered gently beside the dark water while distant boats drifted silently through the night. And once again, as Egypt slowly settled toward sleep, the priests continued their endless sacred routines beneath the watching stars. Night settled slowly across the Nile Valley once again. The last traces of sunlight faded from the tops of the temple columns, leaving only soft torchlight glowing against the stone. The heat of the day still lingered inside walls and courtyards, though the air had begun to cool little by little. A quiet breeze drifted across the river, carrying the smell of wet reeds and distant cooking fires. The city grew softer after dark. Voices lowered. Footsteps slowed. Even the animals resting beside narrow streets seemed calmer beneath the rising moon. Inside the temple complex, the evening rituals continued with careful patience. Priests carrying small oil lamps moved through long corridors lined with painted carvings worn smooth by centuries of touch and dust. Their white linen robes glowed faintly in the dim light. The sounds inside the temple were gentle. The crackling of flame. The brushing of sandals against stone. The faint ringing of metal vessels. Soft chanting spoken in slow steady rhythm. Nothing felt hurried. A young servant entered the sanctuary carrying a shallow basket filled with fresh bread still warm from the ovens. The smell drifted softly through the chamber, mixing with incense and cedar oil. Behind him walked an older priest whose face showed deep lines formed by decades beneath the Egyptian sun. The older man moved carefully now. His knees had become stiff over the years. Standing through long ceremonies had slowly worn down his strength, though he rarely complained. Pain was part of ordinary life in Egypt. Farmers, fishermen, bakers, builders, servants, and priests all carried exhaustion in different ways. The older priest placed a small offering before the sacred statue. Then he bowed his head. For several moments the sanctuary remained silent except for the faint fluttering of nearby lamp flames. The stillness felt deep and heavy, as though the stone walls themselves were listening. Far outside the temple grounds, ordinary families prepared for sleep. A mother washed cooking bowls beside a clay jar of water while her children rested nearby upon woven mats. A fisherman repaired torn sections of net beneath weak moonlight outside his small home near the riverbank. An elderly woman rubbed oil onto swollen feet after carrying water and grain throughout the long day. The city smelled of smoke, bread, dust, and river mud. Above it all, the stars brightened quietly. Ancient Egypt often felt closest to peace during these late hours. The labor of the day had finally slowed. Markets stood empty. Workshops had gone dark. Even the donkeys tied beside homes rested silently with lowered heads. Only the Nile continued moving. Always moving. Its black surface reflected the moon in long silver ripples while reeds bent softly beside the current. Small insects drifted above the water. Frogs called from muddy banks hidden beneath darkness. A temple guard stood watch near one of the outer gates. He leaned against a stone wall holding a long wooden staff while fighting tiredness in the warm night air. Earlier in life he had worked as a farmer farther south along the river. Flood seasons, failed crops, and difficult years had eventually brought him north in search of steadier work. Now his nights belonged to the temple. He listened quietly to the sounds beyond the walls. Distant voices fading through narrow streets. Water splashing softly at the riverbank. Wind moving sand across stone. The rhythm of Egypt itself. Inside the temple kitchens, several workers still remained awake. Tomorrow's bread had already begun to rise beneath linen coverings while clay ovens cooled slowly after hours of baking. One woman cleaned large bowls using water poured carefully from storage jars. Another sorted onions and lentils by weak lamplight while rubbing her tired eyes. Their backs ached from standing all day. But morning would come quickly. Temple life allowed little rest. Nearby, a pair of scribes sat together inside a small room lined with papyrus scrolls stacked carefully upon wooden shelves. One man copied records while the other checked grain totals delivered earlier that afternoon from nearby farming villages. The room smelled dry and dusty. Ink stained their fingers dark black and red. Occasionally one of them stretched sore shoulders before returning once more to the endless rows of symbols marching across the papyrus. Outside their doorway, the temple corridors had grown mostly empty now. Only priests involved in the final nightly rituals remained awake in the deeper chambers. They moved quietly through the darkness carrying incense burners shaped from bronze and stone. Thin smoke curled upward through the warm still air. Some rituals were spoken aloud. Others unfolded almost completely in silence. A priest lit fresh oil inside a lamp before the sanctuary entrance. Another folded sacred linen garments with slow careful hands. Every object had its place. Every movement followed tradition older than memory. The routines themselves felt eternal. Many priests believed their work mirrored the movement of the heavens above. Just as the stars followed fixed paths across the sky, temple rituals followed their own sacred order across time. Outside, the moon climbed higher over the desert. Its pale light stretched across abandoned fields where irrigation canals rested quietly beside rows of dark crops. During daylight these same fields would again fill with laborers bending over wet soil beneath crushing heat. But for now they slept. A farmer lay beside his family inside a small mud brick home near the edge of the city. His hands were rough and cracked from years of lifting water and digging canals. Tiny grains of sand still clung to his skin despite washing before bed. Tomorrow he would rise before dawn once again. The work never truly ended. Floods came. Floods retreated. Seeds were planted. Harvests gathered. Canals repaired. Animals fed. The cycle repeated endlessly beside the Nile. The priests understood this rhythm deeply because their own lives followed similar patterns. Each sunrise brought purification. Each afternoon brought offerings. Each evening brought closing rituals beneath torchlight. Years passed almost unnoticed inside such repetition. One middle-aged priest crossed a quiet courtyard carrying a clay jar of water balanced against his hip. He paused briefly beneath the open night sky and looked upward. The stars above Egypt appeared sharp and countless in the dry desert air. For generations priests had watched these same stars carefully. Certain ceremonies followed celestial movements. Some temples were even aligned with the rising sun or particular constellations appearing during sacred seasons. The sky itself felt alive with meaning. The priest stood silently for a long moment listening to the wind move through palm leaves somewhere beyond the walls. Then slowly he continued onward. Near the temple entrance, several poor laborers slept beneath simple blankets spread against the outer stone walls. They had traveled from another village seeking work connected to new building projects farther north. Too exhausted to continue walking after sunset, they rested where they could. One man coughed softly in his sleep. Another shifted beneath his covering while clutching a small bundle containing all his belongings. Life could be uncertain for workers without stable land or family connections. Failed harvests, sickness, injury, or flooding sometimes forced people onto long journeys along the river searching for survival. The temples often became places of temporary shelter. Not from luxury, but from necessity. A few guards allowed the laborers to remain through the night as long as they caused no trouble. In return, some might assist with carrying supplies or cleaning courtyards at dawn. Inside the sacred inner chambers, the final prayers of the night were nearly complete. The sanctuary glowed dimly beneath a handful of oil lamps. Shadows moved gently across painted walls showing sacred boats drifting through heavenly waters among stars and birds. The oldest priest present spoke the closing words slowly. His voice sounded calm but weary. Years of chanting had roughened it slightly. When the prayers ended, silence returned once more. One by one, lamps were lowered. Sanctuary doors closed softly. Heavy wooden beams slid into place. The god was left to rest until morning. Gradually the remaining priests withdrew into the sleeping quarters deeper inside the temple complex. Some drank cool water before lying down. Others massaged aching feet or stiff hands after hours spent standing through ceremony. A younger priest sat quietly near a window opening overlooking the river. Moonlight silvered the water below. He could hear the gentle splash of oars somewhere in the darkness where a small boat crossed toward the opposite shore. Perhaps fishermen returning late. Perhaps merchants traveling through the cooler night hours to avoid daytime heat. The young priest felt the tired heaviness of another long day settling into his body. Yet beneath the exhaustion there was also familiarity. Comfort in routine. Tomorrow would unfold much like today. The same corridors. The same incense. The same prayers. The same river wind entering the temple before dawn. Outside, Egypt slept beneath the stars. The desert beyond the fertile valley remained dark and silent, stretching endlessly beneath moonlight. Sand dunes shifted slowly in distant winds few people would ever see. Hidden tombs rested quietly beneath stone hills on the western side of the Nile where the dead were buried facing the setting sun. Death itself was never far from Egyptian thought. Priests performed funeral rituals often. Some specialized almost entirely in preparing burials and caring for tomb offerings. Families hoped careful ceremonies would guide loved ones safely into the next world. Yet even thoughts of death were approached calmly within temple life. Like the river. Like sunrise. Like the changing seasons. Everything moved in cycles. The Nile flooded. The Nile withdrew. Fields turned green. Fields dried beneath heat. Children became workers. Workers became elders. And beneath the endless stars, the priests continued their slow sacred rituals through another peaceful Egyptian night. Long before sunrise, the air above the Nile carried a faint coolness across the sleeping land. Darkness still covered the riverbanks and fields, though the stars had begun fading slowly toward the west. The temple stood silent against the pale horizon, their great walls appearing almost black beneath the last quiet hours of night. Inside the sleeping chambers of the priests, soft movement began again. A man turned upon his woven mat and opened tired eyes. For a few moments he remained still, listening to the distant sound of water moving beyond the city. Somewhere nearby another priest coughed softly in the darkness. Sandals scraped faintly across stone floors as someone rose to begin the morning purification. The day returned gently. Oil lamps flickered alive one by one. Their warm light revealed simple sleeping spaces lined with clay jars, folded linen garments, and reed baskets holding personal belongings. Most priests owned little. Temple life left little room for comfort or luxury, especially for those who spent decades inside its routines. One younger priest washed his face slowly with cool water drawn the previous evening from the Nile. Tiny droplets ran across his shaved scalp and down his shoulders before falling onto the stone floor beneath him. The water felt refreshing before the heat arrived. Outside the chamber, the temple corridors remained dim and quiet. The air smelled faintly of incense that had settled into the walls after generations of rituals. Smoke, oil, dust, and old stone created a scent familiar to everyone who lived there. The priests moved silently through the darkness carrying small lamps toward the inner sanctuary. Soon the first prayers of morning would begin. Far beyond the temple walls, Egypt still rested. Families slept close together beneath linen coverings while the final night breeze drifted through narrow windows and rooftop sleeping areas. Donkeys stood quietly beside empty streets. Fishing boats rocked gently against wooden posts near the muddy banks of the Nile. Only a few workers had risen already. Bakers, fishermen, water carriers, and those whose labor depended upon the coolness before sunrise. Near the river, several women filled clay jars while speaking softly together beneath the fading stars. Their bare feet pressed into damp mud at the shoreline. One woman yawned quietly while lifting a heavy jar against her hip. The work of carrying water would continue all day. In Egypt, nearly every task demanded physical strength. A fisherman untangled his nets nearby while kneeling inside a narrow wooden boat. His fingers moved carefully in the weak gray light. He knew the river well enough to work almost without seeing. The smell of wet rope and fish surrounded him while reeds rustled softly in the pre-dawn wind. Slowly the eastern sky brightened. Inside the temple sanctuary, priests opened heavy wooden doors carved with sacred symbols darkened by age. Lamplight flickered against painted walls deep within the chamber. The morning awakening ritual began once more. Fresh linen cloth was unfolded carefully. Incense smoke curled upward in pale twisting lines. One priest cleaned the sacred statue gently using oil stored inside alabaster jars smooth and cool beneath the hands. Another arranged offerings of bread, figs, beer, and flowers gathered from temple gardens. Their movements remained calm and practiced. Nothing changed quickly inside the sanctuary. Outside, however, daylight spread rapidly across the Nile Valley. The city awakened. Voices returned to narrow streets. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children carried baskets between homes. Merchants rolled open woven coverings protecting their goods during the night. The smell of warm bread drifted through the morning air almost everywhere. Near the temple kitchens, workers already sweated beside clay ovens glowing with heat. Dough was pressed flat by tired hands before being placed against hot inner walls to bake. Grain dust clung to skin and clothing while flames crackled softly beneath blackened cooking stones. A kitchen servant wiped sweat from his neck though the sun had barely risen. The ovens never truly cooled. Nearby, large jars of beer stood lined against storage room walls. The thick drink would later be distributed among workers, servants, priests, and laborers connected to temple lands. Beer provided nourishment as much as refreshment. Bread and beer together sustained much of Egypt. In another courtyard, scribes prepared for the day's records. Papyrus scrolls were unrolled carefully upon low wooden tables. Ink palettes rested nearby beside sharpened reed brushes. One young scribe practiced symbols quietly before beginning official work, repeating difficult characters over and over with patient concentration. Writing required discipline. A careless hand could change numbers or meanings. Older scribes corrected mistakes sharply because temple records affected grain supplies, taxes, labor schedules, and sacred ceremonies across entire regions. Accuracy mattered deeply in Egyptian administration. As sunlight strengthened across the city, the temperature rose steadily. The coolness of dawn disappeared quickly. Farmers entered the fields beside irrigation canals carrying wooden hose across their shoulders. Water shimmered beneath the growing light while insects drifted low above damp soil. Oxen pulled simple plows slowly through fertile earth darkened by the Nile floods. The labor looked peaceful from a distance. Up close it was exhausting. Mud clung heavily to ankles. Shoulders burned beneath the sun. Hands cracked from constant work. Still the fields demanded attention every day. One farmer paused briefly to drink water from a clay cup before continuing his work beside the canal. Nearby, his young son gathered weeds from between rows of growing grain while birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by the movement. The Nile gave life generously. But only through endless labor. Back inside the temple walls, priests moved through their morning duties while distant sounds of the city drifted faintly inward. Hammering from workshops. Animal calls. Voices from crowded market streets. The temple itself functioned almost like a small city. Hundreds of people worked there in different roles. Gardeners watered herbs and flowers. Sweepers cleaned dust from endless stone surfaces. Guards watched gates and storage rooms. Servants carried water, food, linens, and supplies between buildings. Everything depended upon routine. Even the gardens required careful attention. Near one outer courtyard, a gardener knelt beside lotus ponds surrounded by reeds and flowering plants. He lifted water slowly using a small bucket while birds moved among the greenery nearby. Temple gardens provided beauty, shade, medicine, and offerings for rituals. The scent of flowers softened the dry, dusty air. Inside shaded hallways, young trainee priests recited prayers together beneath the supervision of an older instructor whose calm voice echoed gently against the stone walls. The boys repeated, and again. Memorization shaped their lives from childhood onward. Many would spend decades performing the same sacred words spoken by generations before them. Over time the prayers became almost like breathing itself. Familiar. Steady. Constant. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The heat spread heavily across rooftops and streets. Merchants draped cloth overhead to create strips of shade above their market stalls. Potters worked beside spinning wheels beneath simple awnings while sweat darkened their linen garments. A woman selling onions and dried fish wiped dust from her face while arranging goods beside the road. Nearby, 2 donkeys loaded with grain baskets moved slowly through the crowded street guided by a tired laborer carrying a wooden stick. Egypt breathed through work. Everywhere people lifted, carried, baked, washed, repaired, planted, counted, and built beneath the powerful sun. At midday, even the temple stones radiated heat. The air inside courtyards shimmered faintly. Workers moved more slowly now, conserving strength through the hottest hours. Some rested briefly beneath shaded walls while drinking watered beer from clay cups. Others continued labor despite exhaustion because duties could not wait. A servant carrying water jars crossed the courtyard carefully. Sweat rolled down his face. His shoulders ached beneath the weight, but he continued walking without complaint. Many temple servants began hard labor while still children. By adulthood their bodies already showed signs of wear from years spent hauling supplies beneath the Egyptian sun. Inside the sanctuary rooms, however, cool shadows remained. Thick stone walls protected the inner chambers from the worst heat outside. Lamps flickered softly before sacred statues while incense drifted lazily through still air. One priest sat quietly there for a moment after completing a purification ritual. The silence felt comforting. Outside the sanctuary, life remained noisy and demanding. But within the sacred chambers, the world slowed. The priest listened to the faint crackle of lamp flames while cool stone pressed beneath his feet. The smell of myrrh and cedar oil lingered heavily around him. For a few moments, nothing else seemed to exist beyond the sanctuary darkness. Then distant footsteps echoed softly from the hallway beyond. The day continued. Afternoon stretched slowly across the Nile Valley. Workers in the fields bent low beside canals while birds searched among the reeds. Fishermen repaired damaged nets in narrow strips of shade near the riverbank. Children chased one another briefly through dusty alleys before being called back toward household chores. The city carried on beneath exhaustion. As the sun finally began lowering toward the western desert, relief spread gradually through the land. Long shadows cooled the streets. Breezes returned from the river. People breathed easier again. At the temple, evening offerings were prepared carefully. Fresh bread, beer, dates, lotus flowers, oil for lamps. Musicians arrived carrying flutes and drums beneath their arms while priests changed into fresh linen garments for the ceremonies ahead. The golden evening light transformed the temple courtyards into warm glowing spaces filled with drifting incense and soft echoes of music. Outside the walls, families gathered for meals after another difficult day. A fisherman shared roasted fish with his children beside a small cooking fire. A stone worker rubbed aching muscles while his wife poured beer into simple clay cups. An elderly woman sat quietly near her doorway watching darkness slowly return to the Nile Valley. And above them all, the ancient stars began appearing once more over Egypt, just as they had for countless generations before. The stars slowly brightened over the Nile as evening deepened into night. Warm air drifted through the city streets carrying the fading smells of cooking fires, river mud, and baked bread. The heat of the day still rested inside the stone walls and mud brick homes, though the darkness brought a little relief to tired bodies. Across rooftops, families sat quietly together beneath the open sky. Some spoke softly about tomorrow's work. Others simply rested in silence. Children leaned sleepily against parents while distant temple music floated through the night air like a slow-moving dream. The sound of flutes and soft drums echoed faintly from behind the great temple walls, rising above the murmuring city before fading into the desert darkness beyond the river. The Nile itself seemed calmer at night. Moonlight shimmered across the water in long silver lines while reeds swayed gently beside the muddy banks. Small boats drifted slowly through the darkness carrying fishermen, travelers, or workers returning late from distant villages farther along the river. An old ferryman guided his boat quietly through the current. His hands were rough from years spent gripping wooden oars beneath the burning Egyptian sun. Tonight he moved slowly, his shoulders aching from labor that had continued almost every day of his life. The river breeze touched his face gently while water lapped against the side of the narrow boat. He had crossed the Nile thousands of times. Yet each night the river still felt mysterious beneath the stars. Back inside the temple complex, the evening ceremonies continued deeper within the sanctuary halls. Oil lamps glowed warmly against painted walls covered in sacred scenes. Shadows trembled across towering columns shaped like lotus flowers and papyrus reeds. The priests walked carefully through the dim corridors. Some carried bowls of incense. Others held folded linen cloth or trays of offerings. The scent of myrrh drifted heavily through the air, settling into clothing, hair, and skin. After many years inside temple life, priests often carried that smell with them everywhere they went. The rituals unfolded slowly. Nothing inside the temple was rushed after sunset. One priest stood beside a sacred statue holding a small bronze lamp while another recited ancient prayers in a low calm voice. The words had been repeated for generations beyond memory. Young trainees learned them as children and continued speaking them into old age. Repetition shaped the temple world. Outside the sanctuary, a group of young servants waited quietly near a storage room wall. They were exhausted after a full day carrying water jars, sweeping courtyards, cleaning bowls, and assisting with ceremonies. One boy rubbed his eyes while struggling to stay awake beneath the flickering torchlight. Tomorrow they would rise before dawn again. Temple work never paused. An older servant handed them pieces of bread left from earlier offerings. The boys ate slowly in silence while leaning against the cool stone wall. Nearby, another worker rolled heavy grain jars into storage chambers guarded carefully by temple officials. Food meant security. Temples stored enormous amounts of grain gathered from taxes and farmland connected to sacred lands. During difficult years, these supplies could become the difference between hunger and survival for entire communities. Inside the record rooms, scribes continued working late into the evening. Papyrus scrolls covered low wooden tables while small lamps burned beside ink palettes. One scribe counted grain totals aloud beneath his breath while another copied festival records onto fresh sheets. Their eyes had grown tired from hours of concentration. Still they continued. The temple depended upon records as much as rituals. Outside the walls, the city slowly drifted toward sleep. Market stalls stood empty now beneath moonlight. Stray dogs wandered quietly through narrow alleys searching for scraps left behind from the evening meal. The sounds of hammering and shouting that filled the city during daylight had disappeared completely. Only occasional footsteps disturbed the stillness. A woman carrying a water jar home late. A guard walking his nightly path. A fisherman returning from the river. Most people had already settled onto sleeping mats spread across floors or rooftops where cooler air moved more freely. Inside one small home near the edge of the city, a farming family prepared for rest after a long day beside the irrigation canals. Their evening meal had been simple. Bread. Onions. A little fish. Weak beer. The father sat near the doorway rubbing his sore hands while his wife folded linen cloth beside a dim oil lamp. Their youngest child had already fallen asleep against her shoulder. The room smelled faintly of smoke and dust. Tomorrow would bring another difficult day beneath the sun. Yet for now there was peace. Farther away, near the riverbank, a fisherman repaired tears in his net by moonlight before finally lying down beside his boat. His fingers moved slowly from exhaustion. Insects drifted over the dark water while frogs called softly among the reeds. The Nile never truly slept. Even at night the current carried boats northward through darkness past sleeping villages, silent temples, and distant fields resting beneath the stars. Back inside the temple sanctuary, the final rituals of the evening approached. The older priests moved carefully now, their bodies weary after long hours standing through ceremonies. One elderly priest paused briefly beside a column while massaging stiffness from his knees. Age came slowly but heavily in Egypt. Years of heat and labor wore down the body little by little. Even those who served inside temples felt its effects deeply. Constant standing, fasting, washing, memorizing, carrying offerings, and breathing incense smoke through endless rituals demanded strength. Still the ceremonies continued. The sanctuary glowed softly beneath lamplight. A priest placed fresh flowers beside the sacred statue while another adjusted linen coverings with slow practiced hands. Incense smoke curled upward toward the painted ceiling where stars and sacred birds stretched across deep blue colors faded by time. The atmosphere felt dreamlike in the late hour. Beyond the sanctuary walls, the rest of the temple had grown nearly silent. Courtyards rested beneath moonlight. Palm trees shifted gently in the night breeze. Water inside sacred pools reflected the stars overhead with perfect stillness. One young priest crossed the empty courtyard carrying a clay jar of water. His sandals whispered softly against smooth stone. He had entered temple service as a small child many years earlier. At first he had feared the dark halls and towering statues hidden within the sanctuary chambers. Now those same spaces felt more familiar than the streets outside the walls. Temple life had become his entire world. The prayers. The silence. The routines. The endless movement of days measured through ritual. As he walked, he could hear distant music fading somewhere deeper inside the temple complex. Slow flute notes drifted through the warm air before disappearing completely into silence. The young priest paused beside a pool lined with stone. Moonlight shimmered faintly across the water. For a moment he simply stood there listening to the night sounds around him. Wind moving softly through palm leaves. The faint crackle of distant lamps. Water dripping somewhere beyond the courtyard. The slow breathing quiet of ancient Egypt after dark. Far across the Nile, desert hills rested beneath pale moonlight. Hidden tombs carved into the rock remained silent beneath the stars. The western desert always carried associations with death and the afterlife because the sun disappeared there each evening. Many priests spent part of their duties assisting with funeral rituals. Death touched every level of Egyptian life. Workers injured during construction. Children weakened by sickness. Elderly farmers worn down by years of labor. Women lost during childbirth. Life beside the Nile brought beauty and abundance, but also fragility. Funeral processions sometimes passed slowly through the city streets toward burial grounds west of the river. Priests carried incense while family members followed behind in quiet grief beneath the heat of the sun. Even mourning unfolded slowly in Egypt. Inside the temples, sacred texts describing the afterlife were copied carefully by scribes onto papyrus scrolls and coffin surfaces. Many people hoped proper rituals and offerings would guide the dead safely into the next world where cool water, fertile fields, and peace awaited beyond earthly suffering. The priests thought often about these matters. Perhaps because they stood so close to ritual every day. Perhaps because life itself felt uncertain beneath disease, flooding, accidents, and exhaustion. Yet the temple routines brought comfort against uncertainty. Each sunrise returned. Each evening arrived. The Nile continued flowing northward. The stars crossed the sky in their familiar paths. And the priests carried on their sacred duties beneath them all. At last the final sanctuary prayers ended. The lamps were lowered one by one. Heavy doors closed softly across the sacred chamber. The god was left to rest in darkness until dawn. Slowly the remaining priests withdrew from the sanctuary halls toward their sleeping quarters deeper inside the temple complex. Some drank water quietly before lying down upon reed mats. Others sat silently for a few moments beneath the night breeze drifting through open windows high above the courtyard. Exhaustion settled across the temple like a blanket. Outside the walls, Egypt slept peacefully beside the dark river. The moon continued its slow journey overhead while reeds whispered along the Nile banks and distant boats drifted silently through the ancient night. The night slowly thinned above the Nile Valley. For a while the world rested in that quiet space between darkness and dawn when even the river seemed to move more softly. The moon hung low above the western desert now, pale and fading, while the stars gradually disappeared one by one into the deep blue sky. Inside the temple's sleeping chambers, the air felt warm and still. Several priests remained asleep upon woven mats spread across smooth stone floors. Others stirred lightly, half awake before the beginning of another long day. Years of routine had trained their bodies to rise before sunrise without needing voices or bells. One older priest opened his eyes slowly and listened. Far away, he could hear the faint sound of oars touching water. A fisherman was already crossing the river. The priest sat upright carefully, his joints stiff from age and years spent standing through ceremonies. He rubbed one hand against his knee for a moment before reaching toward a clay jar beside his sleeping mat. The water inside felt cool against his throat. Outside the chamber, the temple remained mostly dark. Only a few oil lamps still flickered in distant hallways where night guards walked their final rounds before dawn. The old priest stood slowly. His linen robe hung loosely from narrow shoulders shaped by decades of temple life. He washed quietly in a stone basin while nearby another priest shaved the small patches of hair that had grown across his scalp during the previous days. Purity rituals began early. The priests believed the sacred spaces demanded cleanliness and order before the morning ceremonies could begin. Washing, shaving, and dressing carefully were not simply habits. They formed part of the larger rhythm connecting temple life to the movement of the heavens, the river, and the gods themselves. Soon sandals whispered softly through the temple corridors once more. Lamps cast trembling golden light across painted walls where sacred birds, reeds, stars, and river scenes stretched endlessly through the darkness. The air carried the familiar scent of incense smoke settled deep into the stone after centuries of ritual. Outside the temple walls, the city still slept beneath the fading night. Mud brick homes stood silent along narrow dusty streets. Donkeys rested beside wooden carts. Dogs wandered slowly through the shadows searching for scraps left from the previous evening. Near the riverbank, however, movement had already begun. Fishermen untied boats beneath the dim pre-dawn sky while water carriers filled heavy jars beside the muddy shore. Their feet pressed into cool wet earth as the Nile drifted quietly beside them. The smell of the river before sunrise felt fresh and earthy. Wet reeds, mud, cool water, fish. It was a scent deeply familiar to nearly everyone living in Egypt. A young girl helped her mother lift a water jar together between them. The clay vessel was heavy even when balanced carefully against the hip. They would carry it home through the quiet streets before the heat of the day arrived. Nearby, a fisherman crouched low inside his narrow wooden boat repairing part of a torn net. His fingers moved steadily despite the weak light. He had learned the work from his father many years earlier beside these same waters. The Nile shaped families across generations. Skills passed slowly from parent to child like the river itself moving endlessly northward. Back inside the temple sanctuary, the first morning lamps were lit. One priest opened the sacred chamber doors carefully while another entered carrying fresh linen cloth folded neatly over both arms. Their faces remained calm and serious in the dim light. The ritual of awakening the god began again. Incense smoke rose upward in thin pale streams. Oil glimmered softly inside carved alabaster bowls. The priests moved slowly around the statue while speaking ancient prayers in low measured voices that echoed gently through the chamber. Outside, the eastern horizon brightened little by little. Soon sunlight would spread across the Nile Valley once more. Temple servants entered the outer courtyards carrying baskets of bread and flowers gathered before dawn. Some boys yawned quietly while rubbing sleep from their eyes. Others hurried nervously, afraid of making mistakes during important rituals. The temple demanded discipline from everyone inside its walls. Even children learned quickly that sacred routines allowed little carelessness. In the kitchens, workers prepared fires beneath the great clay ovens. Smoke drifted upward through openings in the roof while grain was mixed into dough inside large bowls worn smooth from years of use. The smell of baking bread slowly filled the air. One kitchen worker wiped sweat from her forehead even though the day had barely begun. The ovens created their own heat long before the Egyptian sun climbed overhead. Temple kitchens fed hundreds of people each day. Priests, servants, scribes, laborers, guards, visitors. The work never truly ended. Outside the city, farmers were already walking toward the fields beneath the growing morning light. Wooden tools rested across tired shoulders while sandals pressed softly into dusty roads leading toward irrigation canals beside the river. Birds circled low above the water. Mist hovered faintly across the fields. For a short time the land looked peaceful and cool. But everyone knew the heat would arrive soon. A farmer reached the edge of his field and stood quietly for a moment watching the Nile shimmer in the distance. His family had worked this same stretch of land for generations. The soil remained fertile because of the flooding waters that arrived each year carrying dark rich mud from far to the south. Without the river, nothing here would survive. Already insects buzzed softly above the irrigation channels while oxen waited beside wooden plows. The farmer sighed quietly before beginning another long day of labor. Back inside the temple, scribes settled into their workrooms as daylight strengthened outside. Papyrus scrolls were unrolled across low tables. Ink palettes prepared. Reed brushes sharpened carefully. One older scribe instructed a younger trainee beside him while reviewing grain records from nearby villages. Numbers had to be copied correctly. Storage counts needed constant attention. A mistake in the records could lead to confusion or shortages later. The younger scribe listened carefully. His back already ached from sitting cross-legged for long hours. The room smelled dry and dusty from old papyrus and stored scrolls stacked along the walls. Outside the windows, the city had fully awakened now. Merchants arranged goods beneath linen coverings stretched for shade. Potters shaped wet clay beside spinning wheels. Carpenters hammered wood for boats and furniture while donkeys moved slowly through crowded streets carrying baskets of grain, onions, reeds, and fish. Ancient Egypt breathed through labor. Everywhere people worked with their hands. A woman carried laundry toward the river. Children gathered reeds. Stone workers hauled blocks across construction yards. Bakers sweated beside glowing ovens. Boat builders coated wood with pitch beneath the sun. The temple stood at the center of much of this movement. Not only spiritually, economically too. Large temple lands stretched across fertile areas beside the Nile. Workers attached to these lands farmed crops, raised animals, collected fish, and produced goods supporting the enormous temple systems. Priests oversaw much of this through endless layers of ritual and record-keeping. By mid-morning, the heat had already begun settling heavily over the city. Sunlight reflected brightly from pale stone walls and dusty roads. Sweat darkened linen garments while workers searched instinctively for narrow strips of shade whenever possible. Inside one outer temple courtyard, young trainees practiced carrying offerings with careful posture beneath the watchful eyes of an instructor. One boy stumbled slightly while balancing a tray of bread. The instructor corrected him immediately but calmly. Patience mattered deeply in temple training. Ritual movements had to appear controlled and graceful no matter how tired the body became. Nearby, gardeners watered temple plants using small clay jars lifted repeatedly from a nearby basin. Lotus flowers floated quietly upon sacred pools while palm leaves rustled overhead in the hot breeze. The smell of damp earth mixed gently with incense drifting from deeper inside the temple. As noon approached, the city slowed beneath the growing weight of the sun. Voices softened. Animals rested in shadow. Workers moved more carefully to preserve energy. Even the river itself seemed quieter beneath the white glare overhead. A fisherman guided his small boat toward shore after the morning catch. His arms felt heavy from rowing. Fish glimmered weakly inside woven baskets at his feet while heat shimmered above the water around him. At the docks, merchants waited beneath rough shade coverings to inspect the catch before carrying it toward market stalls deeper inside the city. Everything moved through human hands. Lifted. Carried. Counted. Sold. Prepared. Nothing came easily. Inside the sanctuary chambers, however, calm darkness still remained. One priest adjusted a lamp beside the sacred statue while another prepared fresh incense for the midday offerings. The coolness of the thick stone walls brought relief from the crushing heat outside. For a few moments, the sanctuary felt untouched by time. Only the soft movement of smoke and the faint glow of lamplight disturbed the silence. Then distant footsteps echoed once more from the corridor beyond. Another ritual approached. Another prayer. Another offering. And outside the temple walls, beside the endlessly flowing Nile, the ordinary people of Egypt continued their slow daily labor beneath the ancient sun. The afternoon heat settled across the Nile Valley like a heavy blanket. By midday the bright sky above Egypt had turned pale and almost white with sunlight. Stone walls radiated warmth. Dust hung motionless over the roads. Even the wind moving across the river felt hot against the skin. Throughout the city, people slowed their movements. Labor still continued everywhere, but the pace became softer beneath the weight of the sun. Merchants sat quietly beside shaded market stalls fanning themselves with woven reeds. Donkeys stood motionless with lowered heads while flies circled lazily around them. In the fields beyond the city walls, farmers bent low beside irrigation canals where muddy water glimmered beneath the harsh light. Their feet sank into wet earth while insects buzzed above the reeds. The work was exhausting. One farmer paused beside the canal and wiped sweat slowly from his face. His linen clothing clung heavily to his body. Nearby, his brother guided oxen through thick soil while wooden plow blades cut shallow lines into the earth. The Nile made the land fertile. But the river demanded endless labor in return. Water had to be lifted. Canals repaired. Fields planted. Weeds removed. Crops harvested and carried. Every season brought its own burdens. Back inside the temple walls, the deeper sanctuary chambers remained cooler than the streets outside. Thick stone blocked much of the heat while narrow openings high above allowed only small amounts of sunlight to enter. The air smelled of oil, incense, and old stone. A priest moved quietly between lamps placed before a sacred statue. He trimmed blackened wicks carefully while soft smoke drifted upward into the shadows overhead. Nearby another priest unfolded fresh linen cloth to replace coverings used earlier during the morning rituals. The sanctuary felt peaceful despite the long day. Outside the chamber, temple life continued steadily. Servants crossed the courtyards carrying baskets of grain and jars of water balanced against tired shoulders. Scribes sat beneath shaded halls recording deliveries from farms connected to temple lands. Guards stood near storage rooms where grain sacks were stacked high against mud brick walls. The temple was like a living machine powered entirely by human hands. Every person had duties. Every duty followed routine. One young servant hurried carefully across a courtyard holding a tray filled with small bowls of figs and dates meant for afternoon offerings. Sweat rolled down his neck beneath the heat. He tried not to spill anything while weaving through workers carrying bundles of reeds and folded linen cloth. At the far end of the courtyard, a group of older women cleaned cooking pots beside the kitchens. Their hands moved slowly through cloudy water while nearby ovens continued radiating heat from the morning baking. The smell of bread still lingered heavily in the air. Temple kitchens rarely became quiet. Even after the midday meal, preparations for evening offerings and tomorrow's bread had already begun. Grain was crushed between heavy stones while cooks sorted lentils, onions, and dried herbs inside storage rooms lined with jars. One kitchen worker leaned briefly against a wall to rest her aching back. Her arms felt heavy from kneading dough since before sunrise. Still, there would be more work tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. Ancient Egypt moved through repetition. Near the temple gardens, a gardener poured water carefully around lotus ponds while dragonflies hovered above the surface. Palm trees cast narrow strips of shade across the pathways where priests sometimes walked during quieter moments of the afternoon. The gardens brought relief from the dust outside. Flowers softened the harshness of stone and heat. The priests often used these spaces for prayer, reflection, or simply a few moments of stillness away from crowded temple duties. One elderly priest sat beneath a palm tree with his eyes closed while warm winds stirred the leaves overhead. His breathing remained slow and steady. Age had made his body fragile. His hands trembled slightly now while lifting sacred vessels. His eyesight had weakened after decades spent reading scrolls by lamplight. Yet younger priests still treated him with great respect because he carried so many years of sacred knowledge inside his memory. He had spent most of his life inside temple walls. The rhythms of ritual had become part of him completely. As he rested quietly, distant sounds drifted through the garden from outside the temple complex. Hammering from workshops. Children shouting briefly in the streets. A donkey braying somewhere near the market. The splash of water lifted from canals. Egypt never truly became silent during daylight. Farther down near the riverbank, fishermen sorted their catches beneath rough linen awnings stretched for shade. Small silver fish glimmered weakly inside woven baskets while merchants negotiated prices nearby. The smell of fish mixed with river mud and drying reeds. A young fisherman repaired a cracked wooden paddle while listening to older men discuss flood levels and crop conditions farther south along the Nile. News often traveled slowly through conversations at markets, docks, and temples. The river connected everything. Villages, cities, temples, farms, trade routes, funeral processions, travelers moving north and south beneath the sun. Even the priests depended upon these river journeys for incense, oils, papyrus, wood, and sacred goods arriving from distant regions. Inside the temple record rooms, scribes continued their endless work despite the afternoon heat pressing heavily against the walls. Papyrus scrolls covered nearly every surface. One scribe copied grain accounts carefully while another recorded temple expenses related to repairs on irrigation channels near a farming village several days away. The younger scribes struggled more with the heat. Sweat dampened their hands and wrists while flies drifted lazily through the room. Occasionally someone paused to stretch stiff legs before returning to the rows of symbols marching across the papyrus. The scratching sound of reed brushes never seemed to end. Nearby, a temple physician prepared herbal remedies inside a small chamber lined with clay jars and bundles of dried plants hanging from wooden beams. The room smelled strongly of crushed herbs, oils, and honey. People came often seeking treatment. A laborer with swollen joints. A servant weakened by fever. A child with stomach pain. An elderly woman struggling to breathe in the heat. Some remedies helped. Others simply offered comfort and ritual. Medicine and religion mixed closely together in Egyptian life. Many illnesses were treated with both herbs and prayers, as though healing belonged partly to the body and partly to unseen forces moving quietly through the world. Outside, the afternoon stretched onward slowly. The worst heat would not begin fading until late in the day. A stone worker crossed the city carrying tools wrapped inside linen cloth. Dust coated his legs almost to the knees. His shoulders ached from hauling limestone blocks since sunrise at a building site farther north. He stopped beside a public well and drank deeply from a clay cup before continuing home. Nearby, children splashed water onto one another beside an irrigation channel while older relatives shouted tired warnings from the shade. For a few moments laughter echoed brightly through the heavy air. Then the city settled back into its slower rhythm again. Inside the sanctuary halls, preparations for evening rituals had quietly begun. Fresh flowers were gathered from the gardens. Oil jars inspected and refilled. Musical instruments cleaned and arranged. As the sun lowered gradually toward the western desert, the temple atmosphere began changing little by little. The bright harshness of midday softened into warmer golden light stretching across the courtyards and columns. Workers seemed to breathe easier. A cool breeze drifted from the Nile at last. The river reflected the lowering sun in wide bands of gold and orange while fishing boats slowly returned toward shore. Birds circled above the reeds searching for places to settle before nightfall. The city awakened gently from the sleepy exhaustion of afternoon. Merchants rearranged goods outside their stalls. Women prepared evening meals. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The smell of roasting fish, onions, lentils, and warm bread spread through the streets. Inside small homes, families gathered together after another long day beneath the sun. A farmer washed mud from his feet beside the doorway while his wife poured beer into simple clay cups. A child slept quietly against her mother's shoulder before the evening meal had even begun. An elderly grandfather sat near the entrance watching shadows lengthen across the street while distant temple music floated softly through the air. At the temple itself, musicians arrived carrying drums and long wooden flutes. Their footsteps echoed beneath the stone halls while priests changed into fresh linen garments prepared for the evening ceremonies. Oil lamps were lit one by one as darkness slowly approached. Their golden flames reflected against polished vessels and painted walls deep within the sanctuary chambers. Incense smoke curled upward once more. The rituals continued as they always had. Slowly. Calmly. Without hurry. And outside the temple walls, beside the eternal river moving north beneath the fading sunlight, the ordinary people of Egypt settled gently into another peaceful evening beneath the ancient sky. Evening spread slowly across the Nile Valley. The harsh brightness of the day faded into softer shades of gold and deep orange as the sun lowered toward the western desert hills. Long shadows stretched across temple courtyards and narrow city streets. The heat still lingered inside the stone walls, but cooler air had begun drifting from the river. All across the city, workers returned home. Farmers walked slowly from the fields with tools resting across tired shoulders. Their feet carried dust and dried mud from the irrigation canals. Stone workers rubbed aching arms while moving through crowded streets toward small homes waiting in the fading light. The day had been long. Like most days in Egypt. Yet evening always brought a feeling of relief. Near the riverbank, fishing boats glided back toward shore while the water reflected the glowing sky like polished copper. Nets heavy with fish were pulled onto muddy docks beside baskets of reeds and coils of wet rope. The fishermen worked quietly now. Most were too tired for much conversation. One older fisherman sat inside his narrow boat for a moment after tying the rope to a wooden post. His hands rested on his knees while he watched the river drift past beneath the evening sky. He could smell cooking fires beginning to rise from the city behind him. Bread. Fish. Smoke. Onions frying slowly in oil. The familiar sense of another Egyptian evening. Farther inland, merchants packed away goods from the marketplace before darkness arrived completely. Clay pots clinked together softly while woven coverings were pulled across stalls selling grain, sandals, dried fish, and linen cloth. A young boy carried leftover onions home inside a reed basket nearly as large as his body. Dust coated his ankles as he hurried through the narrow streets beneath the fading light. Nearby, dogs wandered quietly between homes searching for scraps. Children played briefly in open spaces while parents prepared the evening meal. Their laughter echoed softly between the mud brick walls before slowly fading as darkness deepened. The city became gentler at night. Less demanding. Less crowded. The noise of labor softened little by little. Inside the temple complex, however, activity continued steadily. The evening rituals were among the most important of the day. Priests moved through torch-lit halls carrying trays of offerings prepared carefully in the kitchens. Fresh bread still warm from the ovens rested beside bowls of figs, dates, onions, beer, and flowers gathered from the temple gardens. The smell of incense drifted heavily through the sanctuary corridors. Oil lamps glowed against painted walls where sacred scenes stretched across the stone in faded blues, reds, and golds. Priests passed slowly beneath towering columns shaped like lotus blossoms while musicians prepared soft evening melodies nearby. A flute began to play. Low gentle notes echoed through the temple like slow-moving water. Drums followed quietly beneath the melody, steady and calm. Nothing inside the temple felt hurried after sunset. The rituals unfolded with patience. One young priest stood beside a sacred pool washing his hands carefully before entering the inner sanctuary. Moonlight had already begun reflecting across the still water while palm leaves shifted gently overhead in the evening breeze. The young man breathed deeply for a moment. The air smelled of flowers and smoke. After the endless noise and movement of the day, these quieter hours inside the temple often felt peaceful to him. Even the heavy responsibilities of ritual seemed lighter beneath the night sky. Nearby, an older priest supervised several temple servants arranging lamps along a hallway leading toward the sanctuary chambers. Small flames flickered one by one against the stone, casting soft golden shadows across carved figures of birds, stars, and river plants. The temple looked almost dreamlike at night. Beyond the outer walls, Egypt slowly settled toward rest. Inside one small home near the market district, a family gathered around a simple evening meal spread across low-woven mats. Flat bread, lentil stew, a few small fish from the river. Weak beer poured into clay cups. The father sat silently for a while, rubbing soreness from his hands. He had spent the day carrying limestone blocks at a construction site near the temple. Dust still covered his skin despite washing before dinner. Across from him, his wife tore bread carefully into smaller pieces for the children. The oil lamp beside them flickered softly against the mud brick walls. Outside their doorway, distant temple music drifted faintly through the night air. Elsewhere in the city, an elderly woman climbed slowly onto her rooftop carrying a woven blanket. The inside of her home still held too much heat from the day. Like many Egyptians during warmer months, she preferred sleeping beneath the open sky where cooler breezes moved more freely after dark. From the rooftop she could see the temple rising above the city. Its lamps glowed softly beneath the stars. The Nile shimmered nearby in the moonlight. For a few quiet moments she simply watched the river move. The old woman had lived beside the Nile her entire life. She had seen flood seasons arrive and disappear year after year. She had watched children grow into workers, workers grow old, and old people carried westward toward burial grounds beyond the river. The rhythms of Egypt never truly changed. Back inside the temple sanctuary, priests continued the evening ceremonies with slow, deliberate movements. One carried incense while another recited sacred words from memory in a low, calm voice. The smoke curled upward through the warm air. The sacred statue glowed softly beneath the lamplight, dressed in clean linen and decorated with oils and flowers. Nearby, offerings were arranged carefully before the figure. Bread, beer, fruit, flowers. The rituals connected the temple to the wider world outside its walls. The crops grown by farmers. The fish caught in the river. The flowers watered by gardeners. The bread baked by exhausted workers before dawn. Everything eventually passed through sacred hands. Evening deepened. The stars brightened overhead. Inside the temple kitchens, workers cleaned large bowls and prepared grain for tomorrow's baking. Their bodies moved slowly now after many hours of labor. One kitchen servant sat briefly beside a storage jar to rest aching feet. Another carried leftover bread toward a room where temple guards shared a late meal together beneath weak torchlight. The guards spoke quietly while eating. Most conversations at night sounded softer somehow, as though the darkness itself encouraged calmness after the exhausting heat of the day. In another chamber, scribes rolled completed papyrus scrolls carefully before placing them inside wooden chests. Records filled nearly every corner of temple life. Grain deliveries, animal counts, festival schedules, land taxes, repair work, offerings, burials. Nothing important escaped the attention of the scribes. One younger scribe stretched his sore back while extinguishing a nearby lamp. Ink stains covered his fingers dark black. His eyes burned from hours spent reading small symbols in dim light. Still, tomorrow he would begin again before sunrise. Outside, the Nile continued its quiet journey northward through the night. A lone ferryman crossed slowly beneath the moon while reeds whispered along the shore. Frogs called softly from hidden pools near the riverbanks. Insects drifted above the water in pale clouds illuminated faintly by moonlight. The night breeze carried cool damp air through the city streets now. Families settled onto sleeping mats. Children drifted into dreams beside tired parents. Cooking fires faded into glowing embers. One by one, the sounds of Egypt softened into silence. Inside the temple, the final sanctuary rituals approached. The oldest priest present moved slowly before the sacred statue while younger assistants lowered lamps around the chamber. Shadows deepened across the painted walls. The priest's voice sounded quiet and worn with age as he spoke the closing prayers. Years of chanting had roughened his throat. Yet the words remained steady. Familiar. Ancient. When the prayers ended, silence filled the sanctuary once more. The offerings remained before the statue. The doors were closed carefully. Heavy wooden beams slid into place. The god was left to rest until dawn. Gradually the priests withdrew from the inner chambers. Some returned to sleeping rooms. Others lingered quietly in open courtyards beneath the stars, enjoying the cooler air drifting from the Nile after another long day. One young priest sat beside a column listening to distant night sounds beyond the temple walls. A dog barking softly. Water splashing against boats. Wind moving through palm leaves. The slow breathing silence of ancient Egypt beneath the moon. He closed his eyes briefly. Tomorrow the rituals would begin again. The same prayers. The same incense. The same river rising and falling beside the fertile black soil. The same tired workers walking toward the fields before sunrise. And above them all, the eternal stars would continue their silent journey across the Egyptian sky. The deepest part of the night settled gently over Egypt. The city had grown almost completely silent now. Only the occasional bark of a distant dog or the soft creaking of a boat rope disturbed the stillness beside the Nile. Most lamps inside the homes had gone dark. Families slept closely together upon woven mats while cooler night air drifted through windows and across flat rooftops. Above the valley, the stars shone clearly. The desert sky stretched endlessly beyond the fertile ribbon of the river, deep and dark and filled with quiet light. The moon had begun sinking lower toward the western hills where tombs rested silently beneath stone and sand. Inside the temple complex, a few lamps still flickered along the corridors. Temple guards walked slowly through the shadows carrying wooden staffs and small oil lights. Their sandals brushed softly against smooth stone floors worn by centuries of footsteps. Most of the priests had already gone to rest, though some remained awake finishing the final duties of the night. Near the sanctuary entrance, one elderly priest sat quietly beside a lamp almost burned down to its last oil. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. The long ceremonies, endless standing, and years of temple routine had slowly worn down his body. Yet he still carried himself carefully, with the calm patience expected from someone who had spent most of his life serving inside sacred halls. He listened to the silence around him. Somewhere beyond the walls, the Nile moved through darkness. The priest could not see the river from where he sat, but he knew its sound well enough to imagine the slow current sliding past the sleeping city. For generations the river had carried life into Egypt, and every priest understood that without its waters the temples themselves would eventually stand empty beneath drifting desert sand. A younger priest approached quietly carrying a clay cup filled with cool water. The old man accepted it with a tired nod. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary in the late hours of night. Nearby, incense smoke still lingered faintly inside the sanctuary corridors. The scent had settled deeply into every surface over centuries of ritual. Stone walls, wooden doors, linen garments, even the priests themselves carried traces of smoke and oil wherever they went. The temple breathed through ritual. Even in silence it felt alive. Far outside the temple grounds, along the narrow streets near the river, a fisherman stirred awake briefly beside his boat. He adjusted the folded linen beneath his head and listened to the gentle movement of water against the wooden hull. The night breeze carried cool damp air across his face. For a moment he simply watched the stars overhead. Tomorrow he would rise before dawn again. His nets needed repair. The morning catch would not wait. Like nearly everyone in Egypt, his life followed repetition shaped by the river and the sun. Nearby, another man slept against a stack of reed baskets prepared for market. He had traveled from a farming village farther south carrying onions and grain for trade inside the city. Too tired to continue home after sunset, he rested beside the docks beneath the open sky. Travel along the Nile was slow. Boats drifted with the current or moved against it using sails and steady rowing. Merchants, fishermen, laborers, priests, and messengers all depended upon the river paths connecting villages and cities across Egypt. The Nile tied the entire kingdom together. Inside the temple kitchens, the last workers finished cleaning the large clay bowls used for baking and cooking throughout the day. One woman scrubbed dried dough from the edge of a mixing basin while another covered grain jars carefully against insects and rats. The room remained warm from the ovens. Ash glowed faintly beneath blackened cooking stones. The women moved slowly from exhaustion. Their hands were rough from years of labor. Water. Grain. Firewood. Kneading. Lifting. Cleaning. The same work repeated endlessly. Still, there was comfort in familiar routine. Temple life gave structure to every hour. When the kitchen tasks were finally complete, the workers spread simple mats in a nearby chamber and prepared to sleep for a few short hours before dawn returned once more. Elsewhere in the temple complex, scribes carefully stored papyrus scrolls inside wooden chests lined against dry stone walls. One younger scribe lingered over a document illuminated by weak lamplight. His eyes struggled to stay focused. The symbols blurred slightly from tiredness. He rubbed his face and stretched stiff fingers stained dark with ink before finally rolling the papyrus closed. The records would continue tomorrow. They always did. Temple accounts never truly ended. Neither did the rituals. Nor the labor. Nor the movement of the Nile itself. Outside the city, beyond the fertile fields and irrigation canals, the desert rested beneath cold moonlight. Sand dunes stretched across silent emptiness where only wind moved through the darkness. The contrast between desert and river valley shaped Egyptian life deeply. Within the narrow green lands beside the Nile there was water, grain, animals, gardens, people, and temples. Beyond it lay silence and endless sand. Many Egyptians viewed the desert with both fear and respect. Tombs were often placed there because the dry ground preserved the dead. Caravan routes crossed dangerous stretches carrying incense, gold, copper, and rare goods from distant lands. But most ordinary people rarely traveled far from the river. Their entire lives unfolded within its reach. Back inside the sanctuary halls, the final lamp near the sacred chamber flickered weakly. The younger priest who had brought water to the elder now stood alone before the closed sanctuary doors. He checked the beams securing them carefully before lowering his head in quiet respect. Behind those doors rested the sacred statue prepared earlier with oils, linens, and offerings. Tomorrow morning the awakening ritual would begin again. The same prayers. The same incense. The same careful gestures repeated exactly as countless priests before him had repeated them. The young priest found comfort in this sameness. Outside the temple walls, life could feel uncertain. Floods sometimes failed. Sickness spread through crowded streets. Workers suffered injuries. Children died young. Heat exhausted the body. But inside the temple, ritual created stability against the changing world. Each ceremony followed order. Each order reflected balance. At least that was what the priests hoped. The young priest extinguished one of the remaining lamps and began walking slowly through the empty corridor toward the sleeping chambers. His footsteps echoed softly beneath the high stone ceiling. Painted figures watched silently from the walls. Birds. Gods. Boats sailing through heavenly waters. Stars scattered across deep blue paint faded with age. The temple seemed timeless at night. As he passed through an open courtyard, cool air drifted inward from the Nile. Palm leaves rustled softly overhead. The sacred pool reflected moonlight with perfect stillness. The priest paused beside the water. In the silence he could hear faint sounds from the sleeping city beyond the walls. A child crying briefly before becoming quiet again. Someone coughing in the darkness. The distant splash of an oar entering the river. Egypt resting beneath the stars. Far away in the fields, irrigation canals shimmered faintly beneath moonlight while crops waited silently for the return of dawn. Oxen slept beside wooden plows. Birds rested among reeds near the river banks. Everything felt suspended between night and morning. Eventually the priest continued toward the sleeping chambers where other temple servants and priests already rested upon woven mats. Some breathed deeply in exhausted sleep. Others shifted quietly as warm air moved through the room. The young priest lay down slowly and closed his eyes. His body felt heavy after another long day. Yet his mind still carried the rhythms of the temple. Chants echoing through stone halls. The smell of incense. The glow of lamps. The sound of sandals moving across smooth floors. Outside, the stars continued their slow journey overhead while the Nile flowed steadily northward through the darkness, carrying ancient Egypt gently toward another dawn. Slowly, the eastern horizon began to change. The darkness above the Nile softened into deep blue while the stars nearest the horizon faded one by one. A faint line of pale gold appeared beyond the distant fields, touching the edge of the world with the first quiet signs of dawn. Egypt stirred gently from sleep. Inside homes across the city, people shifted beneath linen coverings while cooler night air slowly disappeared. Rooftops where families had rested beneath the stars during the warm night hours now carried the faint sounds of waking movement. A mother sat upright quietly so she would not wake her youngest child beside her. Nearby, her husband rubbed tired eyes while listening to the first distant calls of birds along the river. Soon he would walk toward the fields again with tools across his shoulders, just as he had done almost every morning of his adult life. The rhythm never changed. Sleep. Labor. Food. Rest. Then sleep again beneath the stars. Near the riverbank, fishermen were already awake. The Nile carried thin strips of mist above its dark surface while narrow boats drifted gently beside the reeds. Men untied ropes with slow practiced hands and pushed wooden hulls softly into the water before the full heat of day arrived. The smell of wet mud and river plants filled the cool morning air. One fisherman dipped his hand into the Nile as he climbed into the boat. The water felt cold against his skin compared to the heat that would soon cover the valley after sunrise. Nearby, another man repaired part of a net while sitting cross-legged upon the dock. His fingers moved steadily despite the dim light. He had repaired nets this way since childhood beside his father many years earlier. The river taught patience. Everything connected to the Nile moved slowly. Back inside the temple complex, lamps still glowed faintly in a few corridors where priests had already risen for the morning purification rituals. The sleeping chambers remained dim and quiet except for soft footsteps and the sound of water pouring into stone basins. A young priest washed carefully beside a narrow window opening high in the wall. Cool dawn air drifted across his face while he poured water over his hands and shaved head. Tiny streams ran across the smooth stone floor before disappearing into drainage channels cut long ago by temple builders. Purification before sunrise remained essential. The priests believed sacred duties required both physical and spiritual cleanliness. Water from the Nile carried deep meaning inside temple life. It represented renewal, balance, and order flowing through the world just as the river itself flowed endlessly through Egypt. One by one, the priests dressed in clean white linen garments. Their sandals brushed softly across the floor as they moved toward the inner halls. The temple still felt half asleep in the dim blue light before dawn. Oil lamps flickered against painted walls where sacred symbols seemed to shift gently in the shadows. The smell of incense lingered faintly from the previous night's rituals. Soon the sanctuary doors would open once again. Outside the temple walls, the city awakened more fully. Smoke rose from early cooking fires. Women carried water jars through narrow streets while speaking softly together. Bakers pushed wood deeper into glowing ovens already hot from the first flames of morning. The smell of fresh bread spread quickly across the city. A young boy carrying reeds for a cooking fire yawned heavily while walking beside his older sister. Their feet stirred dust from the road as dawn light slowly strengthened around them. Nearby, merchants arranged onions, fish, figs, and clay pots beneath woven coverings that would later provide shade from the harsh afternoon sun. Everything in Egypt seemed to awaken gradually. No sudden movement. No rushing. Only the slow return of life beneath the rising light. Inside the temple sanctuary, priests entered carrying trays of offerings prepared carefully before sunrise. Fresh bread. Beer. Flowers. Oil. Lotus blossoms floated inside shallow bowls while incense smoke curled upward into the cool chamber air. The sacred awakening ritual began again. One priest approached the statue holding a bronze lamp whose flame trembled softly in the darkness. Another unfolded clean linen cloth with slow careful movements. Ancient prayers echoed quietly against the stone walls. Their voices sounded calm and steady, shaped by repetition over many years. Even the youngest priests already knew most of the words by memory. The rituals had been spoken for generations beyond counting. Outside, sunlight finally touched the tops of palm trees beside the river. Golden light spread slowly across rooftops, courtyards, and temple columns. Birds circled above the Nile searching for fish among the reeds. The coolness of dawn began fading quickly. Farmers moved toward the fields carrying hoes and baskets while oxen pulled wooden plows along dusty roads leading away from the city. One old farmer walked more slowly now than he once had. Years of labor had bent his back and hardened his hands. Yet he still rose before sunrise each morning because the fields demanded constant care. The irrigation canals waited. The crops waited. The Nile itself waited for no one. As he walked, he passed several laborers sleeping beside a wall near the temple gates. They had traveled from another village seeking work on construction projects connected to expanding temple lands farther north. Their blankets were thin. Dust covered their sandals and clothing. One man remained asleep despite the growing daylight, exhausted from days of travel beneath the sun. The old farmer glanced at them briefly before continuing toward the fields. Hard labor connected nearly every life in Egypt. Inside the temple kitchens, activity increased rapidly as the morning advanced. Workers kneaded dough inside large clay bowls while others sorted grain deliveries received before dawn. Fires crackled beneath ovens glowing orange with heat. Already sweat formed along the faces of the bakers. The kitchen smelled warm and heavy. Bread. Smoke. Ash. Ground grain. A woman lifted finished loaves carefully from the oven using long wooden tools while nearby another worker poured beer into storage jars for distribution later in the day. Temple kitchens fed many mouths. Priests. Guards. Servants. Scribes. Gardeners. Laborers. Visitors. The work continued from darkness until darkness returned again. In another courtyard, scribes prepared for the long hours ahead. Papyrus scrolls rested upon low tables while reed brushes soaked inside small containers of water. One older scribe reviewed records from nearby farming villages reporting grain production after the latest flood season. Numbers mattered deeply. Too little grain could mean hunger. Too much flooding could damage crops and homes. The temples tracked everything carefully because survival depended upon order. The younger scribes copied symbols silently beside him. The room remained cool for now, though everyone knew the afternoon heat would soon make concentration difficult. Outside, the city had fully awakened. Donkeys moved through crowded streets carrying baskets of vegetables and clay jars balanced carefully along their sides. Potters shaped wet clay beneath shaded awnings while carpenters hammered wooden boards for river boats and furniture. Children carried water. Women swept dust from doorways. Stone workers hauled limestone blocks toward construction sites. The sounds of labor spread through every corner of the city. Yet even amid all this movement, the Nile still flowed calmly nearby. Its waters reflected the brightening morning sky while fishermen cast nets into the current beneath flights of birds gliding low over the surface. The river remained the quiet heart of Egypt. Inside the sanctuary halls, the priests completed the final moments of the morning ritual. Offerings rested before the sacred statue. Fresh incense burned steadily. Oil lamps glowed warmly against painted stone. For a brief moment, silence filled the chamber. Only the soft crackle of flame and the faint movement of smoke disturbed the stillness. Then footsteps echoed once more through the corridor beyond. Another day had begun. Another cycle of labor, prayer, heat, exhaustion, food, and rest unfolding slowly beside the eternal Nile beneath the ancient Egyptian sun. Morning spread steadily across the Nile Valley. The golden light of the rising sun moved slowly over the fields, touching the tops of palm trees, temple walls, fishing boats, and narrow streets already filling with movement. The cool air from dawn disappeared quickly beneath the growing warmth of the day. Egypt was fully awake now. The city breathed through labor. Voices drifted through market roads while sandals scraped against dusty ground. Donkeys carried baskets overflowing with onions, grain, and reeds. Merchants called softly to one another while arranging goods beneath woven shades stretched between wooden poles. Near the riverbank, fishermen returned from the early morning catch. Their narrow boats rocked gently beside the muddy shore while silver fish glimmered weakly inside reed baskets. Water dripped steadily from rolled nets spread across the docks to dry beneath the strengthening sunlight. One fisherman crouched beside his boat repairing a broken section of rope with tired hands. His shoulders already ached from rowing against the current earlier that morning. Nearby, another man sorted fish carefully into separate baskets while insects buzzed lazily through the warming air. The Nile smelled different after sunrise. Less cool. More earthy. Wet reeds mixed with mud and fish beneath the brightening heat. Farther inland, farmers worked beside irrigation canals carrying water toward thirsty crops planted in the rich black soil left behind after the flooding season. Their feet sank into damp earth while birds searched among the furrows for insects disturbed by the movement. A young farmer lifted water slowly using a wooden shaduf beside the canal. Up, down, up, down. The long wooden arm creaked softly each time he moved it. Sweat already formed along his neck despite the early hour. He paused only briefly before lifting more water toward the fields. The work demanded patience more than speed. Everything in Egypt did. Inside the temple walls, the morning rituals had ended, but activity continued in every direction. Servants crossed courtyards carrying folded linen and jars of oil. Sweepers brushed dust from stone pathways already warming beneath the sun. Gardeners watered temple plants while lotus flowers floated peacefully across sacred pools. The smell of incense still drifted faintly through the sanctuary halls. One young priest stood inside a shaded corridor organizing offerings for later ceremonies. Bread, onions, dates, flowers, and jars of beer rested neatly arranged upon low stone tables. His movements were calm and careful. Even simple tasks inside the temple followed ritual order. Nearby, older priests instructed young trainees in proper ceremonial posture. The boys practiced walking slowly while balancing trays in both hands, trying not to spill the small bowls placed upon them. An instructor corrected one boy gently after he moved too quickly through a doorway. Inside the temple, slowness itself carried meaning. Patience reflected discipline. Discipline reflected order. And order protected the world from chaos. At least that was what many priests believed deeply after years spent inside sacred routines. The temple complex itself felt almost like a small city. Storage buildings lined one outer wall where grain sacks were stacked high beneath careful guard. Kitchens glowed with oven heat from before sunrise. Scribes filled quiet record rooms while laborers repaired cracked stone and damaged wood throughout the courtyards. Everywhere people worked. A servant hauled water jars across a courtyard while rubbing soreness from one shoulder. A gardener trimmed dead leaves from temple plants. A cook stirred lentils slowly above a cooking fire. A guard stood motionless beside a storage room doorway already sweating beneath his linen clothing. The temples depended upon ordinary labor as much as sacred prayer. Outside the walls, the city streets grew louder as the sun climbed higher. Children carried baskets through crowded alleys while dogs wandered lazily between market stalls searching for scraps. Potters shaped wet clay upon spinning wheels beneath shaded awnings. Stonemasons chipped limestone blocks with rhythmic hammer strikes echoing through the warm morning air. The smell of dust spread everywhere. Dust from roads. Dust from construction. Dust lifted by sandals and donkey hooves. Egypt was always dusty beyond the riverbanks. Even inside homes and temples, sand drifted slowly into every corner carried by desert winds. Near one public well, several women waited quietly with clay jars balanced beside their feet. They spoke softly together while drawing water from the deep shaft below. One woman laughed gently at something another had whispered. Their voices blended with the sounds of the city around them. A baby crying nearby. A merchant arguing over grain prices. Wood creaking beneath a heavily loaded cart. The distant call of birds above the Nile. Life moved steadily forward beneath the growing heat. Inside the temple record rooms, scribes bent over papyrus scrolls while narrow windows allowed thin lines of sunlight across the floor. Ink stained their fingers dark red and black while reed brushes scratched softly across the pages. The work required long concentration. One younger scribe paused briefly to stretch his aching neck before returning to the endless records spread before him. Grain accounts. Temple taxes. Animal counts. Festival preparations. Repair lists. Burial records. Everything needed writing. The older scribes often carried deep lines around their eyes from years spent reading tiny symbols beneath dim lamplight. Many developed stiff backs and sore hands long before old age arrived. Still they worked patiently. Knowledge brought respect inside Egyptian society, especially within temple walls. Farther inside the complex, temple physicians prepared remedies inside a cool chamber lined with jars and bundles of dried herbs hanging from wooden beams overhead. The room smelled strongly of honey, crushed plants, oils, and incense. A laborer sat nearby holding one swollen wrist after injuring himself while hauling stone earlier that morning. The physician examined the arm carefully before grinding herbs together inside a small stone bowl. Outside the chamber, a mother waited quietly with a feverish child resting against her shoulder. Sickness touched every level of Egyptian life. Heat. Insects. Poor water. Exhaustion. Injury. People sought help wherever they could find it. The temples often became places not only of prayer but also of healing and comfort. As the morning stretched toward midday, the sun strengthened further overhead. Shadows shortened across the streets. The white glare above the city became difficult to escape. Workers slowed their movements instinctively to preserve strength beneath the rising heat. Near the fields, a farmer wiped sweat from his eyes while guiding oxen through thick soil. His young son carried a small basket behind him collecting stones from the earth one by one. The boy looked tired already. Yet children in Egypt learned labor early. Water had to be carried. Animals fed. Grain cleaned. Reeds gathered. Fishing nets repaired. Life beside the Nile depended upon many hands working together. Back at the river, boats continued arriving from villages farther south carrying grain, pottery, fish, wood, and travelers beneath rough linen sails shifting gently in the wind. A merchant stepped carefully onto the dock carrying a wrapped bundle beneath his arm while shouting greetings toward men unloading jars nearby. The docks never remained quiet for long. The Nile connected every part of Egypt like a moving road of water stretching endlessly northward. Inside the temple sanctuary, the air remained cool despite the growing heat outside. Thick stone walls protected the inner chambers from the harshest sunlight while oil lamps glowed softly beside sacred statues. One priest sat quietly there for a few moments after finishing a prayer. The silence comforted him. Outside the sanctuary walls, the city carried endless movement and noise. But inside the sacred chamber, time seemed slower somehow. Only the faint crackle of flame and drifting incense smoke disturbed the stillness. The priest listened quietly to his own breathing while warm light flickered across painted walls showing birds, stars, sacred boats, and flowing water. Soon another ritual would begin. Another offering. Another prayer repeated from memory. Outside, Egypt continued working beneath the ancient sun while the Nile flowed patiently beside the fertile black earth, carrying the rhythms of life onward through another peaceful day. Now the night has returned once more to the Nile Valley. The heat of the day has slowly faded from the stone walls and dusty roads. The fields beside the river rest quietly beneath the moonlight. Boats drift gently against their wooden posts while reeds whisper softly along the dark water's edge. Inside the temple, the final lamps burn low. The priests have finished their evening rituals. Incense smoke lingers faintly in the still air while the sanctuary doors remain closed until another dawn far away. The long halls have grown quiet now, their painted walls resting beneath shadows and soft golden light. Beyond the temple walls, Egypt sleeps. Farmers rest beside tired hands hardened by years of labor beneath the sun. Fishermen sleep near the river that has carried them through countless mornings. Bakers, servants, scribes, gardeners, builders, and water carriers drift slowly into dreams beneath rooftops cooled by the night breeze. The Nile continues moving softly through the darkness. Steady. Ancient. Endless. Above the river, the stars shine over the silent desert hills where old tombs rest beneath sand and stone. Palm leaves sway gently in the warm night wind. Somewhere far away, water touches the side of a small wooden boat with a slow quiet rhythm. And the world of ancient Egypt grows softer now. The temple lamps dim. The footsteps fade. The prayers become distant echoes carried into the night air. Only the river remains awake beneath the moonlight, flowing patiently through the sleeping land as it has for thousands of years. So now, let the ancient world drift quietly away. Let the sounds of sandals on stone floors disappear into silence. Let the warm desert wind carry away the final traces of incense and dust. And beside the calm waters of the Nile, beneath the endless stars of Egypt, allow yourself to rest gently into sleep.